I'll tell you, there's many other things that I would rather be doing in a more perfect world. But we don't live in a world where I could feel good having that job, knowing that other people were being, harassed, threatened, made to feel unsafe or killed because of who they are. So I continue to do this work.
The far right is having a moment. Some might even say it's on the march. 7 EU member states, including Croatia, the Czech Republic, Finland, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands and Slovakia, now have far-right parties within government. The far-right's footprint seems to be spreading around the world. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. In the summer of 2024, the far right had strong showings in the European Parliament elections. Following the federal election in Germany in February 2025, the populist, Eurosceptic, anti-immigration Alternative for Germany Party, or AfD, is now the second largest party in the German parliament. In early June 2025, Poland's nationalist conservative presidential candidate, Karol Nawrocki, described by commentators as being part of the radical right, surprised many by pulling off a narrow election victory. According to the authors of the book The Great Right North, far-right activism is also on the rise in Canada. They point to the growth of far-right groups like La Meute and Pegida Canada that they claim have attracted tens of thousands of followers across the country. Joining me now to discuss the state of the far-right and white nationalist groupings in Canada is Evan Balgord. He's the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Evan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Evan, do you agree that the far right is on the rise in Canada?
Certainly has been for quite some time. I first started monitoring it and tracking it around the time of some of those anti-Muslim groups you mentioned right off the top started becoming quite active. So around 2016, 2017. And since then, the movement's gone through many twists and turns that we can discuss. But yes, it's fair to say that it's been growing the whole time. It's now at its largest that it's been in Canadian history since, maybe like the 1930s and 40s.
And how big is it then? Like, what numbers are we talking about?
Well, when I first started doing this work, looking at these anti-Muslim groups, they were primarily organizing on Facebook. So back then, it was actually somewhat easier to give you an answer to that question. So we'd be looking at Facebook groups that would have, members in the, low thousands, tens of thousands, or if you might add some of these groups together. That was a number of people who we could see were kind of directly consuming really awful kind of hate propaganda. And again, at that time, mostly directed towards Muslims. These days, their ecosystem is so much more atomized with so many different platforms that they are on that to do a head count would be next to impossible. If you look at opinion polling of people that hold negative views towards certain groups or believe in one or more conspiracy theories that I would associate with the far right, you get this kind of disturbing picture that these ideas might be holding sway with a very large number of Canadians. Anywhere from 10 to 20% of people would be holding some of the views that we would associate with the far right.
And what are those views?
Well, when we talk about the far right, there's been many, many definitions for a long time about what we call the far right or what we have called right-wing extremism. Our definition is meant to be accessible and understandable. And so, we define the far right as those individuals, groups, and movements that harbor racism and other forms of hate. It doesn't necessarily mean that every person espouses them, merely that they are tolerated as part of the essence of the group of the movement. These far-right groups, when I'm talking about far-right groups, I'm not only talking about neo-Nazis, although they would be included under that umbrella, but I'm also talking about, on the less extreme end of the spectrum, something like the Republican Party in the United States, which at this point, I think a reasonable observer would agree here in Canada that, that party harbors racism, other forms of hate, and is dismantling democracy.
And yet you would also say that far-right groups aren't necessarily white nationalist groups?
Not all of them, although then we sort of get into hair splitting of, do they openly espouse white supremacy, or do we take a deeper level of analysis that their position of us versus them is a white supremacist mode of thinking? And there we might have sort of debates over that. But when we focus on far right groups here in Canada and these groups that harbor racism and other forms of hate, primarily, yes, we are looking at groups that I would describe as white nationalist, although not always.
And how is the far right in Canada organizing itself?
It's not hierarchical, and it's not like it used to be back in the day where I guess the term would be like, a card carrying member of a group. You say you're a member of a group, the group acknowledges you're a member. But primarily, the far right operates as a series of interconnected movements that all share similar grievances and kind of use the same propaganda and talking points. The ways that they sort of organize will be around specific issues. And recently in Canada, one of those main issues has been the representation of queer people, in a particular trans and gender nonconforming people, in the education system. So we have groups in the far right, disparate groups that are all upset and hateful towards these queer people. And they might come at it from different places, right? Some of them might be Christian nationalists that thinks that Canada was formed on Christian values and laws and should be governed accordingly, right? They don't believe in the separation of church and state. They believe they should be able to tell women what they can do with their bodies. And they believe that children, shouldn't get sex ed and things like that. You'll see Christian nationalists be active in that issue, but you'll also see neo-Nazis be active in that issue who hate trans people simply because they are.
And so you're saying that these groupings are largely leaderless, and that's by design.
Leaders emerge and have moments, but the primary relationship, I'd actually say, with the far right now parallels where media and technology have gone. It's often a relationship between people who create content, by which I mean people who make podcasts or broadcast live streams or make YouTube videos or do things like that on other more extreme and niche platforms. But it's the relationship between them and an audience that they find of people who support them, sometimes somewhat financially, but otherwise just by creating a community together, whether that's in more extreme channels where they might be creating memes and images to share with each other and propagandize and recruit and encourage violence, or whether that's, in some less extreme spaces. But it's the content creator audience relationship primarily that forms the building blocks today.
So most of the money then is coming from that audience?
So the far right doesn't need like a lot of money to organize or mobilize. Primarily, there are these content creators who are creating content that encourages people to think less of or be hateful towards certain groups. And they don't need a lot of money to do that. They might try to raise money from their audience by essentially putting out a digital tip jar when they do like a hateful live stream, or by selling small quantities of merchandise. But to put that in perspective, when we look at cases where somebody has gone out and done an act of mass violence, right, mass murder, and of course, again, we're talking the most extreme end, it doesn't take oodles and oodles of money to do that. There's enough money in the ecosystem for people to pay their bills, and that's enough for people to be incentivized to create hateful content.
So the far right, you're acknowledging, is on the move, is growing in this country. How is it recruiting members?
Conspiracism, largely. I would say conspiracism is a huge factor. So we saw over the span of COVID, a lot of people were understandably very unsure as to what was going on. The science and different health measures and stuff were moving quickly, and information wasn't always consistent, right? That was the environment we were all living in. And it made a lot of us, myself included, anxious about what was going on in the future. And a lot of people turned to the internet for answers to that. And they didn't always turn to the best sources. And the social media giants allowed misinformation about COVID to flourish. And the number one predictor of somebody believing in a conspiracy theory is prior belief in another conspiracy theory. So when people started discussing COVID conspiracy theories, there's some nefarious plot behind it, right? That's the core of every conspiracy theory, so there's some nefarious plot. But when people started believing COVID conspiracy theories, that was putting them in the exact same online spaces as some of these like far right conspiracy theorists. They'd be starting up the YouTube channels. They'd have the different groups on social media where people would discuss this stuff. So where people were going and like seeing COVID conspiracy theories, they'd be seeing other conspiracy theories. So we saw like a big expansion over that time of people expressing far right conspiracies and opinions.
What are some of the far right groups that your organization is watching right now?
There's a number of smaller ones, some even too small to name, but they form a network of interlocking social circles that we call COM, particularly young collection of people, and a particularly dangerous one. We'll see things like, encouraging criminality, encouraging the distribution of child sexual abuse materials, encouraging self-harm and abuse, and the sharing of evidence of those things happening, and the incitements to mass murder. So while this network may be fairly small compared to like other movements, we keep an eye on that because they are particularly dangerous, especially to youth.
And how do you find out about them, Evan?
We have investigators and we have a network of colleagues that are also very interested in this, right? Extremism researchers from the United States and Europe who keep a close eye on this stuff and have since it got birthed out of other online spaces we were already previously watching. We can trace the birth of this back through like 6 other things that we've been monitoring over the years. So we are in their public spaces where they discuss things and put out their propaganda. These are online spaces that the average person hopefully ever comes into contact with on several online platforms.
And if you do come in contact with them, if a person is just noodling around the internet and finds something that they deem distasteful, what do you suggest they do?
Well, unfortunately, it is possible to come into contact with them because they go out there and they try to find people. And in particular, they look for vulnerable youth. And we are talking about youth with a troubled home life. We're talking about youth who may have, one or more mental health issues, or youth who might feel socially isolated for a variety of reasons. That's sort of the bread and butter of who they try to propagandize and recruit. The RCMP actually recently put out a warning about this calm network and listed some of the warning signs of it. If somebody stumbles into seeing this sort of content, we're probably talking about a youth stumbling into it. That's the most likely scenario we're talking about here. So the message I would send is actually for caring adults who are in youth lives, like educators, parents, things like that, is to frequently talk with youth about the kind of content they're seeing and interacting with online and being engaged. And if something sort of feels wrong, explore it more with that young person and take a look for yourself. If you find it particularly disturbing, a good place to start would be Yorktown Family Services in the GTA has a program that is, I think, particularly effective in counseling youth who might be going down there.
Evan, can you tell us about Diagolon and its leader, Jeremy Mackenzie?
Diagolon is a white nationalist network, and it is led by content creators, the most prominent of which is Jeremy Mackenzie. And several of these content creators that would be the de facto leaders at Diagolon have endorsed neo-Nazi materials, worn neo-Nazi symbols, and they spread hatred towards a number of groups, and in particular, the Jews. Diagolon started as Jeremy Mackenzie and a couple other people live streaming in their basements, and that's still primarily how it operates. The network is made up of the people who resonated with those conspiratorial and hateful messages. They also had a boom during COVID, peddling in COVID dis and misinformation. So they're one of the larger far-right movements in Canada today. Their content, in my opinion, incites violence. We know that there are thousands of viewers / listeners to their content, perhaps tens of thousands. And it went on a cross-country tour. Going off memory, I believe it was something like 16 ticketed events with other meet and greets sprinkled in there, charging up to like $60 a head for some of those ticketed events, which makes it perhaps one of like the largest fundraising efforts by an ideologically motivated extremist group in recent Canadian history. The size of their audience makes them, in my opinion, they're one of the largest threats that a far-right movement presents in Canada today.
You say Diagolon is inciting violence, and yet they're not being prosecuted.
So Jeremy Mackenzie has been charged and acquitted, or had charges dropped of some variety or another on several gun charges. Members of Diagolon were among the men who were accused of plotting to harm RCMP / police officers in Coutts, Alberta during that blockade. We know somebody in Diagolon had a search warrant executed on their house, and they found buckets of ammunition stored next to, a Nazi flag. So Diagolon has brushed up against the law. Back in 2021, actually, I had filed a criminal complaint about Diagolon, along with a big body of evidence of what I believe demonstrates that Jeremy Mackenzie has violated Section 319, subsection 2 of the Criminal Code, which is the willful promotion of hate towards other groups, because the things that he says about other groups of people are equivalent to or worse than what our courts have already found to constitute hate speech criminally. I maintained, in my opinion, several of Diagolon's key figures have broken the law.
You were mentioning the ticketed events that Diagolon has had across this country, and I'm wondering, do you have a sense as to why so many people find Diagolon's message compelling? Why are they attracted to what Diagolon is offering?
Jeremy is angry and entertaining. I have to give him that. If you are a person who finds that sort of thing entertaining, he channels people's grievances. People are angry, they're upset, they believe some things that are frankly not true. And Jeremy gives them an outlet. He gives them somebody to blame and an easy answer. That's the appeal of the far right generally. A lot of the grievances that might bring somebody into contact with the far right, like I said, like somebody's anxious about COVID, right? That might be a grievance. Or, the fact that it's really hard to get ahead right now, or the rich just seem to keep getting richer while the rest of us kind of struggle to get by. Grocery prices are going up. All of these are legitimate grievances. The thing about the far right is that it takes those legitimate grievances, and rather than give complicated or accurate answers to them, it scapegoats a group of people. And that's an easy answer that starts to resonate when people are fearful and scared about the future.
And who are these people? What's the demographic?
When we're talking about people who resonate with Jeremy's message, we're primarily talking about white folks. But I would say that, nobody is really immune to conspiracy theories. And that's one of the reasons that we will see on occasion people of color, women, or queer people also participating in hate movements. It was only recently that there was a Black youth who did a school shooting in Nashville. And in his manifesto and diary were references to a bunch of mass killers, including Canadian mass killers. And it speaks to how nobody is necessarily immune from this. But when we are talking about the far right, we're primarily talking about white nationalist groups. So we are primarily talking about the demographic of membership of these groups being white. However, we do sometimes see some odd alliances. So when we were talking about the issue of queer representation in schools, and I mentioned a certain kind of Christian nationalist who's, very opposed to their kids learning that it's okay to be gay. And for a brief moment of time, they were aligned in that with people with a very conservative interpretation of Islam who also did not agree with that. So we saw at these, so-called 1 million March for Children, for example, we saw both Christian nationalists and some Muslim parents and their kids protesting against education in schools that would make mention of queer people. And I went to one of these demonstrations in Vancouver, and at the same demonstration, I had a neo-Nazi signal in front of my face because it also attracted that. Again, the demographic, we're talking young, we're talking teenagers, young adults. When we're talking about the kind of far right that Jeremy Mackenzie attracts, we're talking about people who aren't young adults anymore, people who are adults at this point.
It seems as if it would be an anomaly, but you did make mention of that Black youth who was attracted to this white nationalist far-right message. Help us make sense of that, because to most people, that would seem counterintuitive. Why would a Black youth, a young person, be attracted to a message by a far-right organization?
I can't say how this kid fell into it, but the spaces that he indicated he was part of as part of his, his diaries manifesto are spaces with neo-Nazism. And we saw in his writings how he hated himself for his race, how he also identified somewhat with the incel movement, which is characterized by its hatred towards women and a very strong hatred for Jews. So he was marinating in this really awful space that also glorifies mass murderers and treats them as saints or martyrs. And he would be watching videos of other mass murders that have happened or reading other manifestos, and that seem to have incited or inspired him to try to carry out his own.
Hate crimes are on the rise in Canada, according to Statistics Canada. I think between 2022 and 2023, the total number of police-reported hate crimes increased from 3,612 to 4,777. And of those police-reported hate crimes, 900 targeted Jewish people, 784 targeted Black people, 228 targeted South Asian people, and 211 targeted Muslim people. And sexual orientation was a motivation for 860 of the reported crimes. Evan, how do you respond to those figures?
Well, we know that the police reported hate crime statistics are bad data, really, really bad data. By comparing them to the general social survey, if you're listening to this, you might have taken part of this before. It's when Stats Canada calls people every year and asks them a bunch of questions. And every 5 years, that social survey has asked questions about what they call victimization. Have you been the victim of theft, violence? Have you been the victim of a hate crime? By comparing that number to the police reported number, we discovered that police only report forward like 1% of what people actually report experiencing in Canada. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the 1% number is important because when you can't really make conclusions based on 1% of anything, because it's just not a large enough sample size to make accurate conclusions about. We warn about drawing comparisons, between groups on the basis of that, although I'm not necessarily disputing that either. We just don't know is the answer. And we could get way better data. It wouldn't be hard. We just need to survey about it at least annually and get that data out faster. Because at this point in time, I don't think that there is a single data project statistic that accurately reflects the state of hate in Canada. And it would not be difficult to do with a few resources if we just did those surveys frequently.
A little earlier in our conversation, you referenced the Freedom Convoy protests of 2022. And I was curious, what do you see as being the connection between those protests, the Freedom Convoy protests, and the far right?
When we talk about the rise of the new far right, we're talking about a phenomenon in Canada that sort of started at 2016. And I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that hate groups didn't exist here before that, or even that some of these hate groups didn't exist before that. That just seems to be the year where things started sort of accelerating rather quickly. When we talk about this movement that I would say started around 2016, 2017 and continues on, it started with a hatred of Muslim people. And it was really spurred on by the migration that was happening in Europe and hate groups that formed as a response to that, like Pegida and Soldiers of Odin, which started over in Europe. And it was also spurred on by Trump's anti-Muslim comments. And we saw groups grow very, very quickly online and their number of members at that time. And then they started doing regular public demonstrations. That group of people that I would call the anti-Muslim movement, that's what I called it back then, they were really protesting against M103, which was this motion to broadly condemn Islamophobia. A lot of people fear-mongered about it, saying it would criminalize any dissent about Islam. And of course it did not, never was going to. Those were simply lies. But when M103 passed and the sky didn't fall, they needed a new issue. So they really became about free speech, anti-fascist, and critical of the government generally. They kind of went through a lull because they didn't have a really strong focal point at that time. And we're talking, late 2017, 2018, if my memory serves me correctly. The next time they had this big focal point was when they started calling themselves Yellow Vests Canada. Yellow Vests Canada said that they were about, Western separation, about supporting oil and gas and things like that. But the groups that started Yellow Vests Canada, Facebook groups, included and were started by all of the people who were part of the anti-Muslim movement. So people who might have joined that group or been invited to that group thinking it was about oil and gas or whatever, they were in this space that was still full of all sorts of anti-Muslim hatred. And some people complained about it and were quickly kicked out, but still they expanded super rapidly in this time. So now we have the Yellow Vests Canada movement. And a lot of people don't know this, but they did a convoy, and that was called United We Roll. That convoy was not nearly as successful as the later so-called Freedom Convoy, but it was almost practice for it. And some of the organizers of that United We Roll convoy ended up being organizers of the so-called Freedom Convoy. And a lot of the content creators and figures that were bolstering the far right and sharing these hateful things at the time of the anti-Muslim movement, Yellow Vest Canada, ended up becoming figures in the so-called Freedom Convoy as well. Pat King is one example of that. So the leaders of this so-called Freedom Convoy had far-right ties or had made Islamophobic or racist statements themselves in the past. The people who were part of the Freedom Convoy were tolerant of racism and hate that was occurring in those spaces, in my opinion. Now, that might not have been everybody's experience that participated in or supported the convoy, but there was enough of it in that space that I think it was fair to characterize the whole thing as a far-right project.
And yet their supporters, their advocates, some of whom were people of color, racialized people, would say, Evan Balgord, you weren't there. How do you know?
We were in a lot of the online spaces, and in fact, for several days we were there on the ground. I would say our characterizations of it were fair.
Evan, recently the U.S. President Donald Trump issued unconditional pardons to 1,500 people who were involved in the violent and deadly January 6, 2021 attacks on the U.S. Congress. He also commuted the sentences of over a dozen people, including Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the far-right Oath Keepers militia, and Enrique Tarrio, the former national chair of the Proud Boys. What impact is Donald Trump and that particular decision of his, what kind of impact is Donald Trump having on the far right in Canada?
It's such an interesting question today because our far right is kind of caught right now. They need to be pro-Canada patriots and nationalists, and yet Donald Trump is also threatening to severely economically harm our country. In terms of his pardoning of the insurrectionists, it sends a pretty strong signal, as have many of the things that he has done since, about what the direction the country is going in. So he essentially incited a group of people to try to do a violent insurrection on his behalf and then pardon them. It's emboldening. It speaks to the laws not applying anymore for people who support him. Meanwhile, the opposite for anybody who opposes him. America as a democracy is in significant danger right now because of the actions of Donald Trump.
I suppose Donald Trump's chief comrade, Elon Musk, recently gave a salute on stage that some people identified as a classic Nazi salute. He denied it, saying that he was just excited being on stage. What did you make of that gesture by Elon Musk, and what's the significance of that particular incident?
I don't know what's in that guy's head. I wouldn't feel comfortable just saying outright it's a Nazi salute. My personal interpretation and belief of it is that if it wasn't done fully knowingly, then it might have been done very well sort of as trolling. He may have known how that was going to be interpreted and did it anyways, even if his goal wasn't actually to pledge allegiance to Hitler. But the entire conversation surrounding the salute is an interesting one. And I actually think that if you take a broader look at the actions that he has done, which I think can be fairly and reasonably said, he has made acts a safe space for neo-Nazis.
He would contradict you, and he would say, on the contrary, he is upholding the values of liberal democracy because he is insisting that this space remain a space where people can exercise their speech freely.
Except he shuts down people whose speech he doesn't like on his platforms. It's just not true. That's all I really have to say about it.
Evan Balgord, you're 32 years old. You grew up in Oakville, Ontario. You attended the University of Toronto. How did you become involved in the anti-racist movement and the anti-hate movement?
When I was a teenager, I was in these spaces that would give rise to Gamergate, which, hateful campaign against women and all the things that has spawned. And I would see content that would try to make a scientific argument that people of color look smart than white people, or that women are actually happier when they're not working and they're subservient to men. I was in these spaces where that kind of propaganda was being shared. Never interacted with it, but I was consuming it. And I went to university. I was lucky enough there to have met a pretty diverse group of friends from different backgrounds and queer people as well. I just became more engaged with the social life that kept me from going too deep down that rabbit hole. I think I can appreciate how, for a young person who might feel socially isolated, how that content seems to provide these easy, compelling answers that make you feel like you should be at the top of the world. I went to school. My views obviously changed quite a lot as I got older. When I was in school, I was really interested in approaching the collective commons problems. So, how can we convince a very large amount of people to give up just a little bit so that we don't destroy the earth? That was a question I was really interested in. So, I studied sociology and psychology, tried to get involved in journalism. I did another shorter degree in journalism. And I went down to the first inauguration of Donald Trump.
In 2016.
In 2016, yes. And when I was down there, I was standing with a group of journalists, and we had just seen a bunch of anti-fascist demonstrators get kettled. The police had surrounded them and pushed them into this vestibule on the street. And I didn't know terribly much about the anti-fascist movement at that time. I saw Patriot Front and other kind of really awful groups like banging shields and being around in helmets and stuff. And I saw anti-fascists demonstrating against the inauguration. I wouldn't say I fully understood at the time. But what I did understand was when the police had all of these people kettled, there were like these two Trump supporters who walked into the back of the crowd, a very angry crowd, a very angry anti-Trump crowd, and walked up to the police line and said to the police, "Hey, can we go through here, cut through this corner and go to our hotel or whatever?" And the police said no and turned like this group of Trump supporters back into a very angry crowd. Right after they'd been heckling them, there was a scuffle that broke out, and then the police surged forward. And I was standing with a line of journalists, and they pepper sprayed all of us at eye level. And I also saw them pepper spray an Indigenous land and water defender so badly in the face that he had like an asthmatic attack of some sort. I came back home after that whole experience of Trump's first inauguration. This was around the time that anti-Muslim movement was starting up and starting to like demonstrate in the streets in Toronto. And I drew the similarities between that happening and the growth of the Proud Boys in the United States and anti-Muslim demonstrations in the United States. And it was pretty clear to me pretty quickly that we are going along a similar trajectory. And so I started reporting on the activities of hate groups in Canada as a journalist and found a niche for doing that here and trying to get larger outlets interested in covering that sort of stuff because I felt it was awful and very important. And I had seen enough people get involved, like get assaulted, that I had become pretty emotionally invested in this work too.
Why do you think the work that you're doing is important? What does it contribute to the discourse? How does it help our communities?
There's a tradition of anti-fascist reporting on the activities of white nationalists, hate groups, etc. And the goal of it, of course, is to not let them organize unopposed, because we've seen how the mere act of shining a light on some of the things that they do and naming people who want to be hateful anonymously is sometimes sufficient in and of itself to stop them from doing those things. Now, that used to be more successful. When we talk about the rise of the far right, that's one of the things that has changed. If we named somebody in a story 5 years ago, they might stop their involvement with a thing, where today it feels like that happens less and less as these far right ideals become more permissible.
It might even be seen as a badge of honor.
In some cases, yes. It's sometimes hard to predict what's going to happen when you report on the activities of a person. But we do it because there's a lot you don't see. You don't know if that person, if their mom called them. You don't know if their boss talked to them. You don't know if their friends talked to them. And you don't know if they started facing some of those like social consequences that might cause them to reconsider their involvement.
You hope, but how do you know that you're actually making a difference? And so how do you measure your success?
We know that our reporting has disrupted or kind of significantly contributed to the shutting down of several white nationalist, white supremacist, or neo-Nazi groups. We know that for a fact because we'll report on them, name the people involved, and then we won't see them involved anymore. So we know that our reporting has had that effect. You know, there's cases where we've provided information on the youth we've been concerned might do an act of violence, and that information has gotten that kid into counseling. And then there's cases where we have shut down some really awful groups with our reporting. So over the course of our time, I think that for our small, usually 4-person organization, we really have managed to do quite a lot.
The work that you're doing, Evan, is not easy work. It can be very dangerous work. You are sometimes identifying some rather nasty actors, some people who are willing to engage in violence, who are willing to threaten you and your supporters. What kind of precautions do you take to protect yourself?
Well, we take a number of precautions to protect ourselves. We've also been contacted by people who might be the victim of a hateful or racist harassment campaign, and we've been able to help them with some precautions to protect themselves too. First and foremost, it comes down to privacy and digital safety, making sure that work can't physically follow you home, making sure that the people out there that want to hurt you or do you harm can't find information about your family very easily. I've been concerned about my well-being or my family's over the course of the work that we've done. For a while, there was a neo-Nazi who was sharing, what he believed was my family's address. And Jeremy McKenzie continued to share that address along with mining out a fantasy of murdering anti-fascists. That is a reality in this work. Although I do want to acknowledge that the threats and harassment that I personally have received pales in comparison to the threats and harassment I've seen received by women and people of color and queer people.
And yet you do receive it. And so the question is the work that you're doing worth the sacrifice? Is it worth your having to watch your back all the time?
I'll tell you, there's many other things that I would rather be doing in a more perfect world. I love scuba diving. I'd love nothing more than to be a scuba diving instructor. But we don't live in a world where I could feel good having that job, knowing that other people were being, harassed, threatened, made to feel unsafe or killed because of who they are. So I continue to do this work.
Well, Evan Balgord, thanks so much for bringing the state of the far right to the surface. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.